Hello, how are you?
Oh,
It's wonderful to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
you bet.
Cool. So what we were hoping you'd be able to do is to talk with us about submodalities. A huge part of what we've been doing on this program is about noticing the difference between being in one's trance and being in a more centered, whole, not entranced state, and what that looks like, and hoping you can maybe share something about your practice in working with that and disrupting the trance, because that's one of the things that I've found most helpful in working with you is trance breaking. So, yeah.
Well, I have a distant background in NLP, neuro linguistic programming. I was involved in it back in the late 1970s. And what several things about it stayed with me. NLP has a mixed reputation, which it richly deserves. And there's quite a bit of emphasis on, come for one session and there'll be a miracle and it'll change your life, which is maybe true on one level, but not so much on another level, like the level the Enneagram is getting at. Because a lot of NLP methods run downhill towards the question of identity. In other words, you can change certain kinds of reflexive behavior, but then the self who has that reflexive behavior, or selves, plural, and is generating those need to be dealt with at some point. And several things I liked about NLP. It's an analysis of successful therapy, at least it was in its original form. And what they were trying to do was figure out what extremely good therapists, famous therapists, all had in common, even though they had different psychotheologies and they had different ways of describing what they did and what they believed they were doing. Standing back from that and looking for the patterns that connect, that were all in common, is part of what they did. And I think they did a really good job that way. They really sort of broke down what's happening in change work, and it's correct, in my opinion. The other thing that they sort of would approach helping somebody change a pattern or a behavior, there's sort of two ways to do it. One is called strategies and one is called inner states. And with strategies, what they're claiming is, first of all, NLP breaks everything down in terms of the senses. And the obvious senses, seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, smelling. What we'll go into with submodalities is the senses within the senses. But when they talk about the habitual behavior, for example, let's say opening doors or getting out of bed or doing something else that you do ordinarily and do chronically and don't think about, they're sort of describing a skill that someone has practiced until it has become a habit and dropped out of their system of reflexes and just became, or dropped into their system of reflexes and just became automatic. Well, that starts to sound like an Enneagram style, at least the low side of it, and the ways in which people get caught up in their own open-eyed trance, personality trance in particular. So that's called a strategy. Something called a strategy means a sequence of internal steps that a person goes through to perform a function. A really obvious one is spelling. Children who win spelling bees, for example, do not spell phonetically usually. They usually spell visually in the sense that they have a kind of Rolodex in their mind, and they sort through looking for the meaning of a word or for word roots, and then can kind of construct the spelling out of a word root. And then if all of that fails, then they might try something phonetically. But for years, they were teaching, over here anyway, teaching children how to spell phonetically. And I had one child who was very kinesthetic. He was very physical. And one of the things that he would do, you'd ask him to spell a word and he would tap it out on his shoulder. And, it was sort of like the word or the letter in the word and the tap were anchored together somehow. But what this is getting at is the nature of a strategy, which is a sequence of unconscious steps that a person takes in order to fulfill a function, but especially a routinary function or something that is returned to again and again. And again, that starts to sound like an Enneagram style. It certainly did to me when I first got involved in it. It sounded like a reality strategy. It sounded like a strategy for making sense of the world by narrowing your attention and screening out, the overwhelming possibilities of sensory awareness. So a strategy is a sequence, and a lot of times with something like the Enneagram, one way I might apply it is to talk about, let's say someone is describing a reaction or overreaction that they had from within their Enneagram style. And I will zero in on and try to get them to be aware of what happened just before that. In other words, what triggered it? What was the first step? How did you know when to have that reaction? An overreaction in this case. And that sometimes is quite useful in the sense that you can apprehend some strengths and resources that the client has. And maybe if you know the Enneagram, you know about the high side, you sort of have a general idea of where you're going in terms of helping somebody grow and change from within their personality pattern. But injecting strengths, capacities, resources at the beginning of a strategy kind of defangs it. It kind of makes it less necessary. It kind of makes it, kind of scrambles it some.
Yes.
And in the scrambling, this is usually considered a good thing. You may have to deal with the after effects of scrambling somebody's Enneagram trance, but that's what we're here for.
Yes, I remember a few times where you spoke about it and also did with me. It's like, can you teach me how to do that? The very thing that I'm complaining about and feeling helpless about. It's like it totally scrambles and breaks that trance of helplessness primarily.
Well, you're jamming something into consciousness, which may or may not work, but sometimes it does. Sometimes it's really helpful. And also you're implying something NLP implies, and most good psychotherapies imply too, is that on some level you're creating this. On some level, this is happening in the theater of your imagination. On some level, this is happening in your body memories, and they're coming out in this way, but they don't necessarily have much to do with the present circumstance. That they're maybe something that was once a proper reaction under in a family where there was a lot of violence or abuse. Maybe that it's not an extreme reaction in a family like that to close up and to go numb or to disassociate or fantasize about the future when you'll be away from that family. But then if you're having that reaction 40 years later, in the present in 2023, it'd be easy to consider it as an overreaction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Am I making sense so far, by the way?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love
Okay,
that.
so there. Whoops. Go ahead.
No, and also it would be great if you could also bring in some of the Ericksonian techniques that you bring to bear as well, because when you talk about that jamming or scrambling, it sounds like that's very much coming from the NLP world. But how does your Ericksonian training work and background complement that scrambly thing?
Well, I'll see if I can get to that. I'm kind of on a track right now. The second piece of the track is what I mentioned before, which is going for understanding internal states that a person may go into, habitual ones that they may go into via their Enneagram style, and beginning to pick those apart, beginning to try to determine which elements in those internal states are the most compelling that drive you to have a reaction that was once appropriate and now is kind of an overreaction in the present. And so you start to zero in on the qualities of the senses rather than in addition to the senses themselves. So if I'm working with a 9, for example, I might, fall into the trap of asking the person what they want. This is often a trap with 9s. It makes more sense to ask them what would make them feel more alive. And asking themselves what they want is something that 9s do when they're going in circles. They'll say, I should want this. This person thinks I want that. Over here, my family has this opinion, and the person's amid a cacophony of voices, a committee of voices, and within that, they can't make up their minds. But actually, wow. I just got a message that said accessory not supported. Go figure. Let's we'll come up with some creative interpretations for what that means. But so if you ask a 9 to focus in on a particular problem, they might draw a blank. They might say, "Oh, well, I just see a fog." And this is second in Enneagram literature, where they talk about 9s having brain fog, essentially. But brain fog in the sense that they go into a cloudy, vague inner state. And within that cloudy, vague inner state, they stay hidden. My assumption in working with 9s is that there's a self who's hiding. Now, if you read Enneagram books, it sounds more fatalistic than that. It sounds more like, well, you've just been struck by amnesia, or you've been struck by fog, brain fog, and you know how it is with fog. It's there in the morning, and you have to wait till the afternoon before it burns off. So the old description is passive, in other words, but actually there's a self who's hiding. And when you start to focus in on that, you start to understand the use of an image like a mental fog, and realize that it's an image, that it's an image the person conjures up that they use to block themselves, or it's an expression of how they feel blocked in their bodies. And then maybe there's a lot of internal dialogue where they're going in circles and they're talking to themselves. And if you're around a 9 who's doing that, one of the things you might begin to notice is that there's a lot of energy and activity up in the head, and that from the neck down, they're numb. There's no feeling. And from the neck down, that's where that self is hiding. And it's hiding usually in the middle of their chest. And it's usually what they get in touch with is a sense of a younger self who gave up on him or herself and gave up on having a really good life and settled for a 70% life, something like that. And as you begin to sort of evoke an image of a self like that, then one of the things that happens is you go from fog to clarity. I can't tell you how many times during the decades I've been working with this thing where nines who have a breakthrough or have some sort of insight or self-understanding or start to connect to themselves and connect to a course of action that means something to them and expresses their values. They use the word clarity. They say, suddenly everything's clear. Now that's the visual component, but then also that you couple that with a relaxed body and a way in which the person is, kind of quiet on the inside, and you have they're more engaged, they're more connected, and they're more. This is what they call right action in Enneagram books, where you can. It's in engaged action, as my friend Russ Hudson would say, where you're connected. And it's the self who's been hiding who gets to come out and have preferences and express themselves from that level, that kind of thing. So what I'm talking about are the senses. First of all, there's the visual, there's auditory, there's kinesthetic, there's even taste and smell. And when you talk about kinesthetic, accessory not supported. Wow. Accessory still not supported. When you talk about the senses, it tends to ground the whole thing. You're working in a way that is immediate and respectful of the person's direct experience. And that's different from blandishments and abstractions and kind of large scale concepts. It's like trying to bring it down to something immediate and present and right here. And in doing that, it kind of cuts through a lot of nonsense and a lot of abstraction and a lot of defenses even. Nines have a what NLP calls a long timeline. Now, what this means is that everybody has an inner way of representing time to themselves, and it's a little different from person to person, but there's some general patterns. One of the general patterns is to see the future in front of you and the past behind you. Well, who does that the most? Probably sevens, within the trance of their style, within their defense. Then there's another version of it where you see the past off to the left on a spectrum, and off to the right is the future. And that's another way to represent time. And then another way to represent time is to go into a kind of atemporal zone, which is actually more characteristic of nines. But one of the other things that they can have is what's called a long timeline. So you're interviewing a nine and they're 62 years old, and you ask them, about a conflict they're having with their son, their adult son, and would they like to work on that? And the nine's experience is, I'm only 62 and I'm going to live a long time. So what's my hurry? And I'm going to live a long time is sort of like the nine concentrates on the future and they see it slowly and languidly and laconically unfolding out before them. And if you ask nines a hypothetical question, which is, to what age do you expect to live? The answer is almost always between 85 and 110. Well, what does that do for motivation to change? Well, it kind of takes the fire out of it, kind of takes the urgency out of it. But also the person will see the future, kind of slowly, inevitably unfurling out in front of them in some slow, quiet day. It's like a wonderful summer afternoon, you know. And I'm going to live to be 110, so what's my hurry? Things like that become really relevant in the internal dialogue part, where nines are talking to themselves, and they're talking to themselves in sometimes their own voice, but a lot of times they're talking to themselves in other people's voices. What would my mother think? What would my father think? What would my ancestors think? What does my boss think? That kind of thing. What does my spouse think? What do my children think? And this is all about, some decision that the person may have to make, like they just lost their job and they're looking for another job, and they'll have internalized other people's opinions about what kind of job they should be looking for. But in fact, they're not looking for a job. They're pretending to look for a job. And pretending to look for a job kind of keeps the other voices at bay, but actually it's also an avoidance of risk in a certain way. So these are all considerations. If you have something like a background in NLP, or if you know something about submodalities, or if you start to think about sensory qualities and what it means to alter them, what it means to identify them, and how to work with them. And that's what I'm hoping to talk about today. Confusion technique. There's something from hypnosis where a hypnotherapist has a client, and the client likes the hypnotherapist, but the client says, it's impossible for me to be hypnotized. And then the hypnotherapist begins to tell a lengthy story that's overly complicated, that seems to be going in one direction, but then turns abruptly and goes in another, and is hard to follow. And the harder it is to follow, the more tired the listener gets. The more tired the listener gets, the more receptive they are to trance. They drop into it, they get sleepy. Well, this also parallels something in nines. When they're listening to their internal dialogue and listening to cacophony of voices, it's sort of pretty much the same situation. And when they confuse themselves, they have trouble thinking clearly sometimes, or they think in opposites that have nothing to do with each other. Should I become now that I've lost my job, should I become a tennis pro, or should I move to Hong Kong and study acupuncture? And you find out a month later, neither one amounts to the nine, or neither one the nine cares about. But in doing that, there's a way of being lost and a way of being confused. And if you confuse yourself long enough, then you fall asleep. Or in the case of nines, you sort of go mentally asleep. And listeners who listen to nines talking in sagas have the same experience, which is it's almost like a joke with no punchline, or a town with a drug with no side effects, a town with no main street. Where you're following the story and you're following the story, but you can't quite get it. And then after a little while, you get really tired and maybe annoyed also, because there's an anger underneath it in nines. Maybe they're wasting their time and they're willing to waste your time, for example. But within the anger, that's that kind of sleeping volcano quality that nines can have, unlike, say, eights, where the anger is pretty obvious, and even in ones, the anger can be pretty obvious. Oh, so is this making sense so far?
Yeah, Well, very much for me. I had a coaching client yesterday, a 9. And the reason she
Uh-huh.
wanted the session in a corporate environment where I did some teamwork was because she wanted to choose between a leadership role and a technical specialist role. And that's what's
Mhm.
and her boss said to her, you have to choose. Can't wait forever. And she was convinced that she didn't know. And working with the senses and the energy in her body, like how do your arms feel when I say the list of words that you said about the one role versus the other? And it was so
Mhm.
obvious to me where all her energy was, but she didn't know. So it was like, okay, now
Mhm.
I'm going to say this word and then that word. Notice what happens to your chest. The things that I'd already seen.
Mhm.
And it worked really. By the end of it, she's like, oh, it's obvious. I'm going to go and tell him right away what I want. So,
Mhm.
yeah. So,
Clarity.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's great. Anybody, like maybe, I mean, you're personally attacking the 9s in the room. Let's maybe attack
I am.
other
Oh,
types.
I didn't know that. I'm so sorry. I the accessory doesn't work, so I can't see the people who are bleeding.
So you just have to watch for the people going like this.
Yeah, there's been a couple. Yeah.
Yes. Um, and so maybe if
So,
we can talk about 5s a little bit.
sure. Uh, I was going to work my way around,
Oh, brilliant.
starting
You've
with
got
starting
time.
with 9, and
Yes.
then going backwards because 9's always, in workshops you get to 8 of the Enneagram styles, and then you run out of time. No, that's my joke. Um, so working with 8s sometimes, for me, it's helpful to understand how they are split and to maybe help them resolve a split. And the split is usually between somebody really strong and somebody vulnerable or weak, perceived as weak or afraid, or represents somehow the 8's passions and sensitivities. And those are the things that they're kind of polarized against, based on maybe their early experience of life, where it just wasn't remotely safe to be passionate or sensitive, and they adjusted, and they made a good adjustment. They created a good strategy for defending themselves under those circumstances. It's just now, again, it's 40 years later, and you're still reacting as though you're back in that same space time, but you're not. And so working on getting those closer together is important. It's a strange thing about 8s, although every Enneagram style has its paradoxes. But in the trance of the 8 style, the idea is if I can bully and overpower and squelch my sensitivities, then I'll be safe. And so there's this internal back and forth. The 8 doesn't usually realize that they're bullying themselves. They may be sensitive to it in other people, and there's a tendency within the style to defend themselves by noticing their dynamic in other people, but not as clearly in themselves. So there's be a couple of family members who have a consistent conflict, and the 8 will watch it closely, and they'll notice the one family member who seems stronger and the other family member who seems weaker and sensitive or fearful or something like that, and they're sort of transfixed by the dynamic, while they simultaneously don't realize that dynamic is within them, that it's an expression that it's displaced. It's you might say projected, but it's not exactly a projection either, but certainly a displacement. So one of the things that 8s will do sometimes when they're in their trance is there'll be a churning in the belly that yields to something like an energy that comes up and oftentimes out their mouth. One woman who was an 8, she says, I try to behave well all the time, but sometimes petrodactyls fly out of my mouth. And, it's sort of that. Now, in that churning, the churning is physical rather than emotional. And this is characteristic of a lot of Enneagram styles, in my opinion. 8s, 9s, and 1s, certainly, and also 5s to a degree. And occasionally others are capable of it, where you take an emotion and you turn it into a sensation. So an 8 might have an emotional reaction to something someone said, but then suddenly they're aware of feeling numb, or they're aware of having a sensation of some kind, but not an emotion. So they say, that guy really made my skin crawl, or that when she said that, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, that sort of thing, where there'll be a physical reference, but not an emotional one. I first learned about this many years ago in a workshop where there was a man who was an 8 with a 9 wing, and he was a tough guy. But he was also he had this boxer poet contradiction that 8s sometimes have. It's in the sexual subtype usually, where they're, both they have artistic elements in them, and that they sometimes express, but then at the same time they're tough guys. And this guy had been a boxer, and he'd been a merchant marine and a few other things. And we're doing an exercise which is called anchoring, which is where we're trying to evoke capacities in people and then pair them with a touch. And this is real basic NLP as well, but it's really a helpful thing if you ever think to look it up on Google or something. Look up NLP and anchoring. And so but it did involve a touch. And so the woman who was with him, young, pretty, and blonde, and then he's old and he's tough and he's kind of weathered, and so they're sitting there in high contrast but getting along with each other just fine. And the woman's touching him on the shoulder, and he says, I don't feel anything. I just feel the warmth from her fingers. I just feel a little bit of the sensation. I feel the pressure where she touches me on the shoulder. And what I said was, well, just keep touching him, and just hold it there, and let's just wait. And we waited not very long, about a minute or so, and he burst into tears. And what that started to tell me, and what I started to notice in lots of people, is that the translation of emotion into sensation is a kind of defense. But then when you really zero in on the sensation, sometimes the emotion comes forth, because it's hidden in the underneath hidden by the sensation somehow. The other thing about 8s is that when they're in their trance, they think in caricature. Now this varies from person to person, but to a degree, it's there in many 8s. And what it means is if they feel disrespected, or they feel uncertain or insecure in some way, they'll start to see, or they're angry at somebody, they'll see that person as a cartoon, as a caricature, as a sort of like in wartime, the way the enemy is characterized in political cartoons, or in political cartoons. You don't even need a war. You can see it there. And so it's like they'll take in a feature, the person's nose, and they'll exaggerate it. And they'll see it when you go to carnivals sometimes, or you see street artists sometimes who do this, where they'll you pay them, they'll create an affectionate cartoon of you, and it's exaggerated. And so The 8 is actually being mean or angry or fighting with a cartoon rather than a three-dimensional person. And making the conversion from 2D into 3D is sometimes helpful with 8s also. In other words, getting them to realize what it's like when they are mad at somebody, maybe mad at somebody they love. How do they see them then? And how do they see them when they're not mad at them? What's the difference? And usually the difference has something to do with dimensionality. You see, if you see somebody as a cartoon, you're seeing a 2D representation. And if you see somebody as they are in front of you, a living, breathing gestalt of a human being, then you're seeing correctly and accurately and with presence. Mm. So seeing people in terms of caricatures, being able to kind of, and then auditorily, it will minimize. They'll say things like, well, when I threatened to kill her, I was just kidding, that kind of thing. And it's sort of like, okay, minimizing takes the edge off of something, and it lessens the impact, but it's also an indicator of the 8's lack of realization of their own strength. They may, in some ways, some 8s, kind of relish in their own strength and their ability to get their way and maybe even overpower other people. But there are other 8s who don't quite realize how angry they sound. And you can generalize that to 8s, 9s, and 1s, I think, that they don't, all three of them don't realize how angry they can sound. And in that anger, it's like bullfrogs. I don't know if you have bullfrogs in South Africa. We have them here. And bullfrogs are provided by nature with a flap that closes over their ears so that when they broadcast in their really loud voices, they don't deafen themselves. That's a good way to think about it in terms of 8, 9, and 1. The minimizing and the effect of minimizing. So a person might an 8 might not hear themselves, and that would be a kind of good course of action. When you start, there are a lot of 8s who don't have much internal dialogue, in my experience. But there's plenty who do, but there's some who don't, and it's kind of striking, actually. They're internally, they're kind of quiet. They might be arguing with somebody every once in a while, but by and large, they just don't sort of communicate with themselves that way, you might say. Are there any 8s in the group? No. And 9s? Are there 9s in the group? So Yuma, could I ask you about what I said about 9? Anything you relate to or don't relate to?
Yumna as a
Yumna. Okay, sorry.
Yumna's not a 9 though. The 9s are Robert and Michael.
Michael, could I ask you? Sorry, Yumna. We'll get to you later.
I'm really upset with you that you just called us out like that. Like, like everything you said was just really spot on and really frustrating.
Yeah, I get that a lot.
Yeah, the relationship to time, and lack of urgency, and like this like atemporal space, and really continuing to go to sleep to myself, and even the anger itself, like avoiding that anger. It's like, oh, I just can't deal with it right now, so just put it off, put it off. And then what I didn't quite understand was like, how do you get them to, or get people like me to touch into that clarity or recognize how we reinforce these states? Like, how do you do that with a client in real time?
I get them upset. That's pretty much what I do with nines. Not always, and it depends on the person, depends on what they want. But you're kind of demonstrating the reaction, Michael, which is I get them upset and describe their character structure in so complete and precise a way that it's staring at them. And then when it's staring at them, then we start to explore and fish for and try to find the self who's hiding. And usually beginning to understand that and then go into appreciating how the self had a need to hide back in the day.
Yeah, I really like the self is hiding piece because it gives us back our agency and says we're doing this to ourselves, and therefore we can choose a different alternative.
Right. It's sort of like the difference between saying a 6 is a fear type versus saying a 6 scares themselves. Same idea. And a lot of Enneagram literature, at least in the old days, I haven't been reading in a long time. The sense of agency was kind of not very well emphasized, I thought. It was more fatalistic than that, and more, you're born, it's genetic, there's nothing you can do about it, there's a number stamped on your forehead, and good luck. And by the way, try to meditate. And if you catch yourself, doing neurotic things, well, just stop it. So just knock that off. That was pretty much the idea. And agency is important. It's one of the things you're casting around for if you're working with people, if you're doing coaching or working with clients in some form or another, is finding out where they have a sense of choice. In other words, a person could say, well, I remember a couple that came in years ago when I had a private practice, and he was an 8 and she was a 2, and they sat down and he said, I want you to change her. And of course, that was a taller order than getting him to focus in on his own reactions and working with those. So, Michael, you're almost upset enough. I
can't hide my face. So.
Yeah. But the thing is to kind of play with the idea that you learned how to hide, and what it did for you, and anything that you might think it still does for you. Because we get attached to our coping methods. They call them, in NLP, they call them secondary gains. In psychiatry, they call them advantage by illness. But it sort of means the same thing, which is we're hanging on to something that got us this far and that used to work really well, or as effective as possible under unpleasant circumstances. And now, we've kind of forgot what we're doing, except we react automatically like we're opening a door. We have this kind of unconscious skill, but it's a skill designed for another time and place. Let me see if there's anything else. No, so let me talk about 7s. I'll talk about 5s, 6s, and 7s. With 7, they'll describe monkey-mindedness, where your thoughts have a hop skip pattern and they jump from one thing to another, and then oftentimes then there's not only a disconnect between the subjects, like you start out thinking about baby formula, and 5 minutes later you're upset about the situation in Ukraine, something like that. And if you ever try to kind of look for the links, they don't really make any sense. They're irrational in nature. They just jump from one thing to another. And it's nevertheless a kind of escape pattern within 7, where they'll when they get anxious, they'll go into scattered thinking. And in the scattered thinking, there's usually a future thrust in it. And sevens will usually see the future out in front of them and put the past behind them, which on the one hand used to work. And on the other hand, it might have additional consequences or unintended consequences. For example, when sevens are in their trance and they're feeling stuck or criticized or limited or frustrated in some way, they'll put the past behind them maybe too quickly, so that when it's behind them, they don't have to deal with it, but it's really something they should deal with. And then putting something behind you or putting something away or tucking it away somehow or another. The opposite of that in sevens is jumping into the future, coming up with a fantasy about the future, about your next vacation in Botswana, and then stepping into the picture so that you disassociate from the present by associating into the future or into a fantasy about the future. It's not really the future. It always reminds me of, at least where I live, we have weather reports that are 7 days long, where they'll predict what the weather's going to be like for the next 7 days. And then if you go back 2 days later, the whole thing's changed, which makes you wonder what the value of the initial prediction was, or the value of predicting that far in the future. But it's what the implication is that the future forecast is based on new information in the present, or is a reflection in the present. There was a book one time I saw called The Future Remembered. And I didn't know if a seven wrote it, but boy, it was all about different decades in the United States and how the future was conceived within those decades, and how that conceived future was a reflection of what was going on during those decades. In other words, it actually is a metaphor for real life now in the present. But if the seven can make it abstract and make it kind of glamorous enough, then they can escape into the future. There was a book many years ago called The Seven Rays that I came across. It was a kind of esoteric, it was the same group that that Madame Blavatsky was the head of. And Krishnamurti was a member for a while until he kind of renounced it. And I'm blanking on the name. That's an old person's problem.
Theosophy. Was it anthroposophy or theosophy?
Theosophy. Yeah, thanks. And the seven rays sounded a little like the Enneagram, minus a couple of Enneagram styles. But what she was emphasizing in the seven rays was, don't get caught in the glamours of your style. Don't get caught in the glamour of the ray that you see the most or that you identify with the most. And I like the word glamour quite a lot. You're sort of like there are certain Enneagram styles that kind of glam up their defenses, and seven is certainly one of them. So if you're going to escape into the future, into your next holiday in Botswana, you better have a kind of detailed image of it, and maybe even color it up in a certain way, make it look more exciting than it could possibly be. And in that glamorizing, you escape a dull or painful or judgmental or limiting present. So they're in relation to each other. Also, this is another way to think about gluttony. Somebody, if you were looking for the strategy to create gluttony in yourself, you'd probably start with anxiety. And the other thing that is useful to think about with sevens is that they're not they're head types. That is to say, they go up into the visual and auditory part of their experience. Their feelings follow that, but they don't start with feelings. And when they're glamorizing, when they're not glamorizing, they do start with feelings. But if they get close to a certain feeling that they don't feel they can handle, then they go into the glamorizing. And when they get close to certain feelings, usually the belief is, even if it's unconscious and unstated, the belief is that they are not sufficiently equipped to deal with those feelings, basically. So if I start to cry, I'll cry for a month. If I, let this one piece of negative information in, I'll be depressed for 6 months. That kind of expectation. Therapists and coaches can play into that sometimes. I remember various clients, where you could get them upset. You could get them in touch with their shadow in some way. And they would say, oh, yeah, this is really valuable. And I look forward to the next session. And then they canceled. And you can find that a lot with, sometimes you can find it in friendships with sevens as well, where they'll come and they'll tell you they'll pour their heart out, tell you all their troubles, and then they avoid you because it's like tag, you're in. But in the doing of that, there's this glamorizing and making things look better than they are. And, you have to make them more colorful. You have to make them more lively. You can't see a frozen picture and get that response quite as well as if it's a movie, so that there's, something in progress, and there's a process. And so the sevens will glamorize themselves that way, or glamorize possibilities. The other thing that is helpful to emphasize is that there is a part of the seven that feels trapped anyway. You might, as a seven, go into a new job and think this is going to be great. This is the people are great. The whole thing is very clear. And then maybe 6 months later, it's turned into a jail. Well, the reason for that is that you had a jail inside of you already, and a part of you that is sensitive to feeling in jail, feeling trapped, feeling locked in a psychological closet. And in doing that, then you're sort of still staying out of touch with the part of you that feels that way. I find it actually, as a coach, I find it really helpful to get sevens closer to that within themselves, if they can stand it, and if it's not based on profound abuse or something like that, in which case it's a longer process. But getting aware of a self who is trapped, and it's usually in the chest, but not always, but it's somewhere in the body, and there's usually an emotion that goes with it, and usually emotions follow, and it's emotional in nature. It's located somewhere in the body, and definitely worth hunting for, because that's who's in charge when the person is reacting out of the trance of their Enneagram style. That's who's in charge. I talked about time and time distortion. One other thing to say about that is it goes back to what Einstein said about relativity, which is when you're working a job that you don't like and you're watching the clock, the time slows to a crawl. When you're with someone that you've just fallen in love with and you're sitting on a park bench, the time flies incredibly fast. And that's time distortion. That's time expansion and time contraction. And in those, in that awareness of time, that's another way to understand what sevens go through when they get in touch with their feelings, is that the feelings feel like they'll last forever, the negative feelings. And in doing that, then, why wouldn't you avoid them? Also, since 7 is in the 5, 6, 7 range, all 3 of those styles tend to project their power, to project their agency. They'll see it out there in some unconscious way. With 5s, their fears are specifically social usually. With 6, it can be more existential or about survival or about acceptance in a group. And within 7, the fears are about missing out and being trapped and being limited. But what's helpful to realize, at least it was for me, is that 7s don't exactly fear their own pain. They fear unsolvable, endless pain, which is their fantasy about what will happen if they get even a little bit in touch with these things that they typically kind of run away from. And what they're saying is, I've projected my power. And so I don't think I have the power to actually go into this and survive and be able to function. I think it'll just capture me. My pain will capture me, and off we go. And the next 6 months or so will be, sort of suffused with that. But actually, it's helped me a lot to encourage the 7 to go into the pain for 5 seconds and then come back out again, and then go in for 10 seconds and then come back out again, and go in for another 10 seconds, come back out again. This is called fractionation in hypnosis. It's what you do with a client who is afraid of hypnosis, but they've tried everything else and they're desperate for a solution. And so maybe they saw those B movies where evil, swarthy looking hypnotist hypnotizes a blonde, Teutonic looking young woman and makes her bark like a chicken or rob liquor stores, that kind of thing. Those mind control hypnosis. And what you're after in a situation like this is to build a bridge between the person's conscious, the 7's conscious awareness, and the aspect of their experience that is in pain, and to sample it and then come back out, sample it and then come back out. And often at times I will tell a 7, you go ahead and sample it, and 10 seconds, come back out, and I'll tell you a joke. And the purpose of telling them a joke is to take over their capacity to rationalize, because otherwise they might, say, "Whoa, that was a tough thing. Boy, it reminded me of a time I was, met this guy who was training to become an astronaut, and then something goes off into a story, but it gets disassociated. But if I tell the joke, then I've kind of taken over that. And it makes the whole thing go smoother that way. Plus, the jokes are usually pretty good, and so they're entertaining. I'm not bragging. I just have good taste in jokes. So going in, coming out, going in, coming out, doing it in a more gradual way, locating the pain in the person, locating the self who is in pain, getting aware of the sort of difference between the future and the past. Some of the time, the person is fleeing from the past into the future. That's another way to think about it. Sort of like I had an early marriage and I was very unhappy, and I just left all kinds of things, loose threads and things dangling, and made a difficult situation, but I just kept concentrating on what I wanted instead and where I was going instead. And so you're simultaneously fleeing something and going towards something. A woman that I know who was a 7, she said one day that she was very busy and had a full plate of activities for the day, and was preoccupied with where she was going. And she walked out of her house, and there was a little series of 3 steps, and then the lawn. And she walked out of the house and fell on the lawn. And she stepped on one of the steps and then fell on the lawn. And what she realized later was that she was actually 3 feet ahead of herself. That her idea of where she was and where her body was were different. And so, you know, it was easy to fall on the grass when you didn't, you know, quite know where you were, and she tripped on the steps. And that kind of thing sometimes you'll see also. You can also see it in a 7's body. There'll be a kind of sometimes a back and forth sort of thing, or talk about the future, you lean forward, talk about the past, you lean back. I've seen 7s who were listening to arguments between other people in their life. Ultimately, it was the 7 doing it, but they were listening to various people in their lives and their opinions, like a puritanical mother, for example, and a passive father. And there's a back and forth, and you can see the 7 going back and forth also as they listen. Their head will move a little bit. Things like that. Do we have any 7s? Steph, could you say something about anything you can confirm or deny? And then I'd like to ask Annie also.
Yeah, lots of resonance around the futurizing things and glamorizing. My first husband had multiple sclerosis, and by the time we had 4 kids under the age of 5, including twins, he was wheelchair bound. And so we saw the wheelchair was the great toy that has to get places. So MS wasn't an issue. It was only, could we get him in the wheelchair so that we could go, you know, and we'd go shopping, and he'd push the trolley. He'd have the twins on his lap. He'd hold on to a trolley, and I would be pushing him. He'd be pushing the trolley, and the other 2 would be getting the shopping off So we glamorized. We turned it into this playground for many years until I couldn't do it anymore.
They call it reframing also.
Yeah, that too. 7s are really good at that.
Well, yes and no. I mean, to their advantage and then to their detriment.
Well, yeah, that's
depends on how much you do it and what your motives are. Yeah.
But yes, so lots of resonance and around the jumping into the future, imagining what it could be, and then in most cases actually making that happen. But yeah,
sure.
very, very much so lots of connection with what you're saying. Thank you.
Thanks. And Annie, could I ask you?
Sure. I don't have the power to survive, like the pain is huge. Actually, I just started a mantra of I can handle this. I can handle this in a relationship with my daughter, an 8 daughter. And so that mantra has been very helpful. Sampling the pain, I think, is really helpful from a coaching perspective. And then taking over that joking role and relieving me of the habit of reframing and glamorizing. I thought immediately of the diving bell and the butterfly. I don't know if anyone knows that movie, as the ultimate horror movie for a 7, which is a man who has a stroke and is trapped in his body. All he can move is his eyelids, and he can't communicate to people to help him commit suicide. That is like my greatest nightmare. So I really appreciated. I've rejected the 7 as a type for myself off and on over the years, and it's mostly to do with the stereotype around pain. I don't avoid pain. I'm actually fairly masochistic at points, but it's about being a hero. It's glamorizing the physical feats that I do. There's a lot of glamour in that. And then I thought I was a 4 because I was so deep into an 8, a poet. He was actually a poet and a boxer, both.
There you go.
And the emotional pain that he inflicted on me was immediately glamorized into this life that we had, which was I was a writer and he's the artist and the boxer, and it's just so easy. So the last thing I'll say is the first thing I said to the first therapist who did any good for me was, "You will not help me reframe, and you will not be someone I can just talk to. I don't need anyone to talk to. I don't need a reframer. I need a breaker of my reframer machine. It's an instant rationalization machine that is toxic." So she became very tough for me, and that's the biggest healing I've had, is just really asking for that toughness and not allowing me to do that.
Mm-hmm. And when you think about rationalizing, how did you do that?
Oh God, mostly in the name of growth, personal growth. So and mostly in the name of, maybe I think, combined with Catholic background.
Would you
I will
see
go.
would you see things a different way when you were rationalizing? And I know you mentioned the auditory component of it, which is, you can reframe, you can talk in abstractions, you can create a plan for the future, whatever. But there's an internal state that goes with it.
So you're asking me what that internal state is for me?
As far as you can conjure it up.
It's exciting. Kind of, I think that's the 4, what I thought was a 4. Maybe it's in my tri-type, but just very, I got fodder to work with to develop my fantasy. The emotional depth is part of a picture of myself that I'm creating. It's exciting, and make it exciting. It's got that level of kind of tragic romantic, but it's all, as I think you said, in a tape cassette. I'm listening to you on a cassette set from 1970 or something. It's all cracked. Some neighbor gave it to me. I have this boombox to listen.
No, it wasn't that long ago.
Because you're just in the dark ages with technology. Well, it just said, no, it's like they can be tragic romantic, they can be all these things, but the outcome is still to get happy, to feel better, to avoid this pain. And that, tell you, that just cleared up my confusion about my type completely, because I'm trying to get to the happy place. It doesn't matter if I'm in the unhappy place for months. I can do that in order to, but the end game is there. So it's an excitement and an energy pushing forward to make that happen. Yep.
Yeah, and if you take the bull by the horns and kind of decide to go near your pain, at least in a limited way for a limited number of seconds even, sometimes that initiates a process where you're more in charge from the beginning.
Yeah, well, Tom, I think I've done about 100 hours of EMDR in the last 2 years, where I've sat in the most painful parts with my adult part and all that business. And I would say for a 7, that is huge, 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 huge. Because it's just a moment, the thing goes across the screen, and then I'm there, and I know I'm going to get out because she's going to bring me out, and I come out, and I'm okay. And so those types of therapies I think are crucial, but I'm really in it because I think 7s are pretty courageous, because there's a sense that we're so focused on getting past the pain. We have a lot of good skills on getting out of it. So if you give me a structured way to get in it and out of it, and I know the plan, I will do it. Yep.
Good for resilience.
Yes.
You bounce back from things faster than other people sometimes.
Yep. The stress tolerance is so huge for 7s.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks. Anybody else? Any observations or anything? Anything, clients who bedevil you with their patterns? No, thankfully you all have good clients. Okay. So
Allison's got her hand up, Tom. Allison.
what's that again?
Allison wants to say something. Her hand's up.
Okay. Sorry, my screen is acting up. Yes, Allison.
Hey Tom, I'm a two. I'm worried that you're not going to get to the twos and the ones
I don't
in
care
terms
that
of the
much.
time. So I'm just making that point, but I'm really loving everything you're saying.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, yeah, I don't think we'll get there, but whatever. Okay. So 7. So talking about sixes. Sixes, when they're in their trance, their vision could be either vivid, like seeing a movie up close from the first or second row in one of those loud multiplex theaters they have now, or it could be dark and hazy and kind of unclear, but part of a belief about the universe that the six is living in, that it's got its dangers. And that usually is an expression of a six having projected their power. In other words, they take their power out of their body, they take their power out of their belly, let's say, and smear it onto the face of a boss or a parent or a spouse or somebody else in their life that they have conflicts with, or in a broader, more abstract way, they can smear it on conspiracy theories, for example. There's a lot of that going around these days in political and health circles. But the exaggerated, you take your anxiety, which otherwise might live in your chest, and it produces anxiety rather, and you're seeing your projection, and then you feel anxious here in the chest and maybe a steel band around the middle, sort of like your agency and your will and your capacity to take action from your center is frozen in a grip, and then you're basically paying attention to an outside source that you've projected your power onto. They're a stand-in for your power, and you're reacting to them and trying to stay safe in relation to what you think is the fact of their behavior, or the fact of life in the world, and what's dangerous about it. A lot of times, if you're going to scare yourself, you need to use big imagery. If you have a tiny postage stamp size picture of something you're afraid of, it's not going to produce the same result that a large, overbearing movie screen will produce. And what sixes are doing is scaring themselves in order to be safe. The idea is, if I scare myself enough and anticipate what can go wrong enough, then I'll be safe. But by the time I've done that, I've made myself feel vulnerable, weak, young, and resourceless. So it's kind of back to front. You think you're doing one thing, but you're actually sort of doing another. And you need to make the images big. They have to be larger than you. Maybe if a client sees their boss in their mind's eye, the sixth client, the boss will have to be larger than the client, and it'll roughly correspond with how a child might see a parent in terms of differences in size. But it's important to have the screen be big if you're going to scare yourself, and also up. It has to be, it's like if you put somebody on a pedestal, that could have a literal meaning. You could see them standing there and they're larger than you, and they're on a pedestal. which means they're above you. And a lot of times sixes will see, something that represents their fears, something that represents their power that they projected onto. And then it'll be large, loud, colorful, vivid, and above them. And the colorful, vivid part of it, if you're trying to scare yourself and you conjure up in a scary image, it's probably not in pastel colors. It's probably in vivid colors, because then there's more of a reaction from your nervous system. If they're in pastel colors, it might be soothing. It wouldn't make sense. So instead of a postage stamp sized something that represents your power that you've projected, you go with a giant picture. The picture's above you. It's vivid, and also it's not usually a frozen picture. Usually it's a movie. Usually it's something that involves steps. One thing happens, and then something else happens, and something else happens. And so in your story to yourself, there's danger going forward with each step. And if you're looking at it as a frozen picture, it's probably not as scary. It just kind of sits there, although it's possible to scare yourself with a frozen picture as well. It's just more usual that it's processed. And we'll see when we get to ones, there's almost an opposite thing to do, which is to take a frozen picture and turn it into a movie on purpose. Well, I don't know. You need to have a loud soundtrack if you're going to scare yourself. You need to, just like you need vivid colors and a movie. If you scare yourself and it's a quiet, pleasant soundtrack playing new age music, it's probably not going to be as scary. And so your intent, your defense is to scare yourself in order to be prepared, although it doesn't really work out that way. It's paradoxical. You scare yourself in order to be prepared, but then you're not prepared because you feel weak and young and resourceless. But that was a good way to navigate your experience of your early life and the people in it. So that's there. Lots of I understand you've been studying a little bit of Peter Levine's work, and that actually is quite helpful for sixes as well. Body work of some kind that if somebody is really a flaming six, they're really in their trance and they haven't really ventured out of it very much. They essentially have PTSD, in my experience. And thinking about what works with PTSD, which is usually sometimes a kind of dissociative pattern where you witness yourself having the fear rather than having the fear, and you learn about you let the fear express itself, and then you learn about alternatives. That's usually a helpful thing with PTSD, and I think it's a good thing to keep in mind that traumatized sixes anyway usually have something like PTSD to one degree or another. They say that soldiers who go fight in wars who get PTSD, they think that the soldiers already had PTSD. In other words, they had extremes in their background, and they had a sort of strategy already. Let's pretend they're all sixes, where they were, scaring themselves and haunting themselves with difficulties and traumas and memories anyway, not really the difficulties of the traumas, but the memories of the difficulties. And in that kind of lays the groundwork for developing PTSD when you go to war and kill strangers. Anybody relate to this? Do we have any 6s? Samantha, could you say something about what you can confirm or deny?
I cannot deny.
Oh.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I scaring myself in order to be prepared is really true. Also, feeling like if I'm organized, if I can organize what's going on out there, I'm doing that to sort of soothe inside. So situations where I can't organize and I can't put a structure on because people are jumping around all over the place, I'm a social 6, are quite traumatizing for me. I'm in one at the moment. I'm working quite closely with what I believe, who I believe are 2 7s, who are kind of bouncing off each other. And I've been sort of almost brought in as a balancing, grounding influence. And of course, I feel like I've been invited into my nemesis almost. So
you're the bad guy. You're the villain of the piece.
Potentially, if I play that role, right, I'm going to be limiting the freedom of the 7s, and
Right.
so I've just kind of called myself out on that.
So-called freedom.
Yeah. So that's the other thing that you were talking about the movie and things like that. I was thinking there's a big piece about proximity to me. So if something feels like I'm not in right relationship with it, so it's not out there enough, I experience it as a kind of an overwhelm.
Right.
So I'm not in kind of correspondence with it anymore. I've been almost subsumed by it.
Right.
Hence doubling down on the getting it back in right relationship. Sitting in the overwhelm, I've kind of realized, is probably actually tolerance for the overwhelm is probably a power move. Because
yes,
otherwise, where do you go? You can't organize the world. The world's very chaotic.
Well, and there's
to my 6.
There's that expression, the tyranny of the weak. I mean, that's another way to think about it. Is, I'm a 6. We're all in a workshop, and you invite me to lunch, and I say, well, that'd be fine. I'd love to go to lunch with people, but I don't know what you're planning to have for lunch. I don't eat Mexican food. So if you're all, if you all have your heart set on Mexican food, well, go ahead. And don't worry about me. I'll be fine. I've got some stuff back here at the workshop. By the way, I don't really like to ride in other people's cars anyway. And I never drive on freeways. I don't know what, I never drive on really busy highways because they just seem dangerous. I don't like Mexican food because of an experience I had. It's not something I'm just making up. I was in a Mexican restaurant. I had some food and got sick. And it took, oh man, I was sick for days, sicker than a dog. And the waiter was just rude, and I didn't even like the food. And it was in 1972 in Tucson, Arizona, but I remember it like it was yesterday. So who's in control? Who's in charge? Yeah. But it's a paradox.
6s have got good memories often too.
Yes. Yeah. Good memories, not for what happened, but for their reaction to what happened, or there was a study done with MRIs a few years ago where they took some people who said they'd had childhood trauma, gave them MRIs, and found out that their when they remembered a childhood trauma, they were remembering it. They were remembering the last time they remembered it. So if I thought about my horrible childhood 2 weeks ago, and then I think today about my horrible childhood, that's what I'm remembering is 2 weeks ago. I'm not remembering decades ago.
What are your strategies for working with a 6, Tom?
Basically, zero in on fears and take them apart and micro analyze them to the point where it's only one thing, and that one thing turns out to be quite feasible and doable and connects the 6 to their agency. Another one is to take a 6 that you have a rapport with. You have to have some humor and a kind of, a certain amount of grace with, and to take a fear and to exaggerate it to the nth degree, as far as you can possibly go. And the fear will turn into something that is rather the opposite of the fear, which is to say it might be funny, for example. And sometimes that's really good. It's sort of the worst that can happen, that kind of fantasy. But taking it to an extreme where something in the person starts to tell themselves, oh, this is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Thank you.
Um,
Kristen has arrived, Tom, and Kristen is a 6.
Kristen has not arrived. She's still in transit.
Yes, we're driving. Hello.
That's
I'm
right.
so sorry I missed all the things you just said.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Oh, that's too bad. Well, maybe later, maybe if there's a recording or something like that, you can be horrified in the privacy of your own home. Okay, so 5s. We've only got 5s, 4s, and 3s to go, so we're in pretty good shape. 5s. That's my joke. It's funny sometimes. It's funny in English, actually. With 5s, the tendency is to disassociate, of course, the defensive tendency, and to maybe sometimes float above a circumstance and to kind of witness themselves and somebody else that maybe they're having a conflict with, or there's a situation of some sort, and they have a certain kind of skyward perception of it that is sometimes pretty useful. So 5s can specialize in intellectual abilities, and you might think of the realm of academia as a realm that is somewhat populated predominantly by 5s. Don't know for sure, but at the same time, the idea of being versant in a subject that you then turn around and teach and share with others, but that your basic thrust in life is to pursue knowledge. That can be fairly typical. And then the pursuit of knowledge sometimes has a runaway quality about it because it's defensive. If somebody's sort of out of touch with themselves as a 5, they can be interested in this, interested in that, jumping into a new subject area that maybe no one can follow them into. They could be experts on, bridges in Afghanistan that were built between 1860 and 1903. And there's a certain expertise, and there's 12 people in the world who know as much as the 5 does, and they're all in a chat room somewhere. And so you can go share the knowledge and exchange knowledge, but also you're sort of protected by knowing something that's so obscure that, for example, your invasive mother can't come into your room when you're a teenager and overwhelm you with her emotions about her fight with your father, that kind of thing. And so what you're trying to do is stay disassociated, but at the same time, of course, you do have emotion somewhere, and you could marry them. You could marry a 5 could marry a 2 or something like that, and there could be a kind of discrete distribution of jobs within the relationship. But the capacity within this to pull back and do a sort of 3-dimensional zoom, where you're kind of looking down on things from a distance, is often a capacity within this style. Like I said, not all 5s are intellectual. Before the pandemic, I used to go to Tokyo pretty regularly, and occasionally in certain tourist areas, what you would see would be a man who was very focused. He was wearing a spyglass, and he was sitting at a little table, and he was very focused on carving a face into a grain of rice. And he's surrounded by people, but he's isolated and alone. He's got a very particular, precise skill that not many people share, and he's sort of alone within it, alone within the practice of it. And that can be another sort of manifestation. But with 5, the acquisition of knowledge, the acquisition of perspective, the acquisition of skills can be a sort of forefronted factor in their behavior. Occasionally, a person, when it's defensive, the person will gather too much information, and they'll tell themselves once they've gathered enough information, then they'll take action, but then they get lost in the information gathering. I had a friend who came to where I live, and it's an area where people go on holiday, and he came, and he's a photographer, and he came with a list of places that he wanted to go and photograph. And a couple of times we would sit down at the dinner table after dinner, and he would ask questions about this place that he was going to go the next day, and how to get there. And he'd bring out the maps, and he'd bring out the tourist brochures and things like that. And we go over it, this particular place, and the photographs he could take, and what it was like, and how to get there, and so on. And then he would get up in the morning, and he would get in his car with all his equipment and start out for the place we had talked about, and he'd get lost. He did it several times. So it's sort of like you're gathering information, but at a certain point, it creates a blockage to taking action, rather than a smooth glide path towards getting what you want. So sometimes the information gathering can be defensive. Sometimes there's a background image of the world, quote unquote, the world. With the Enneagram, I think, the simplest way to understand an Enneagram style is that it provides you with a set of motivations, a self-image, and a picture of the world that is metaphorical in nature. It's sort of in the back of your mind. And with 5s, that picture of the world, when they're in their trance, can be of some place empty and uninhabited, and maybe like looking out across a stark plain or something like that. And, nobody's there. It's not nihilistic exactly, but it's, I don't know, sort of spectral in a way, sort of like you're in a no man's land of some sort. 5s with a 4 wing will start to sound like 4s, actually. Sometimes they'll say, I feel like I'm from another planet. There's been a cosmic paperwork mistake, and I was dropped on Earth and raised as human. And but within that, I'm of the world, but not in it. Whereas the goal in working with fives is to get them to be in the world, but not of it. That image, or that type of image, not that specific image, but that type of image is not uncommon. Another thing that fives can do is, I talked about this a little bit, they can not only zoom out and look at a situation or look at a subject from a larger perspective and a more detailed perspective, but they can also zoom in. Sort of like the zoom function in a camera in your computer, except the five can do it in their mind. They can pull back for perspective and then zoom in on particular details, and then maybe later pull back and later zoom in on other details, something like that. But the capacity to zoom is not vouchsafed as easily to every Enneagram style in my experience, but fives can do it. Not all fives, but a number of fives. A friend of mine who's a five can see images in his mind in 3 dimensions. So if he's imagining a particular situation, or maybe a sculpture or something that he saw in a museum, he can visualize in his mind the sculpture, and he could, if he wanted, turn the sculpture around, see the back of it, or move his perspective around and see the back of it, something like that. And in that perspective, you have I don't know, it's just a knack, it's just a capacity. Not all fives do it, but some do. And when the images are 3-dimensional, it's just I don't know, it's a cognitive capacity more than anything, but it's something to be aware of sometimes. If the 5 is talking about people that they want to avoid, those people could be 2-dimensional in their mind's eye, and then you could help them, turn them into 3-dimensional human beings, something like that. Do we have any 5s in here? David, would you be willing to share what your experience is like?
Well, I can really relate to the idea of seeking a lot of knowledge in kind of obscure subjects. And I can get really interested if I know that I'm the only one in the area that's interested in this. But when other people start getting interested in it, well, now I'm not really that into it anymore. I find something else that makes me feel special in my knowledge.
Right.
So I relate to that part very much.
Do you have a sort of an ease with technical details and then kind of creative inspiration at the same time?
Yeah, actually, I'm kind of a tech guru, so details of doing that, working with computers and debugging and that kind of stuff, but also thinking big picture. I'm a pastor preacher, and so every week as I'm writing my sermon, which I was doing last night, I have to have it fully formed in my head, the larger picture of everything with how things work. And then I sit down and the details just fit into that larger picture, but it has to be fully formed in my head before I can start putting the details down. And I have to have it all worked out.
And if you didn't have it all worked out and you just started anywhere, what would that be like?
I have done that, but I've learned how to be really quick in at least forming a bigger
picture
way, a bigger path that I want to follow, and then the details kind of follow along. Kind of like a jazz musician. I have the melody line and the chord structure, but then I can pop into it. But I have to have that, at least a melody line, and I have to have some sense of where the chords are going to go, and then I can preach or do whatever. But I have to have that big thing as well as some of the details. So yeah, I can relate to that as well.
Start with the inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
In jazz, there'll be a melody line, and then part of the pleasure of it, I guess, is how far away from the melody line a performer can venture while still staying connected to the melody line. There's that kind of tension running through it until the end of a piece, where it usually comes back to a summary of the melody line.
Mm-hmm. And I find that works with working with clients as well. They might start off with something they just kind of threw out and they're not sure what to do with it. And then they go off on all kinds of other parts of their experience and the conversation. And then about 35, 40 minutes later, I said, remember you said this at the very beginning? You see where this fits now? How does that fit with what we've just been talking about? And they go, oh, how did you hold on to that? How did you make, so that's something that I, kind of, I don't even have to think about it. It's just kind of flows with that. So keeping the details as well as following the larger.
And you're sort of talking to the person's conscious and unconscious in a way. Well, it's good. Those memory pills are working.
So far, yeah.
So far, so good, yeah.
I don't know. You want to say Yumna's a 5 also, so she didn't raise her hand, but I don't know if she wants to.
I picked on her earlier. I don't know. I hope she's forgiven me.
It's fine. I think what I resonate with the most is this idea of this 3D zoom overlooking things and able to come back.
Zooming.
So, and that enables a lot of being able to connect dots easily. So, you can see the big picture and the detail at the same time.
Right.
So that is something that it's sort of just a natural part of self. But the one thing is this idea of running away and hiding out in knowledge. And idea of like, if you're hiding away from your mother who's having an emotional outburst or something, and then just
that
also makes it lands a lot. It resonates a lot.
It what a lot?
It resonates a lot. It does land.
Yeah, there's it's a boundary. There's another way to think about it. I'm going to disappear into my knowledge of Afghani bridges, and no one can follow me except the 12 people I know online in the chat room. And there's a privacy within that, and a boundary within that, and an escape within that also. And like you said, hiding in a way, and probably a necessary and good adaptation at the time. And then, when it's decades later and you find yourself doing the same thing, you start to wonder, is this something I really need, or do I need this much defense? Is it really producing the effect that I hope for? Maybe I'm a 5, and I grew up in a family that was emotionally pretty non-communicative, but we all sat around the table and played cards and word games and things like that. And that was how we connected. And then I tried to do that with my own children, and they're not as interested, and it's producing an opposite reaction. My wife tells me that actually, when I'm trying to do that, the children feel like they're irrelevant to the activity that I want to have us all get involved in. And when they feel that way, you're sort of producing the opposite effect, the opposite result of what you intended. And then fours, twos, threes, and fours are all in a group of Enneagram styles that don't really project their power. That's not really what's going on. Usually within these styles, on some level, especially when people are in their trances, their personality trances, there's a way in which there's a kind of running identity crisis. Sort of like, who am I now? Who am I to these people? Who am I in this circumstance? What am I supposed to be? What do I not want to be? But it's sort of like you experience the world as socially conditional, and you have to do something in order to be rewarded. You have to do something in order to be loved. You have to sing for your supper. And in doing that, you earn the right to be loved. And in the meantime, there's a playing of roles. With all three of those styles get caught up in roles to a greater degree than some other styles anyway, where you start to avoid and disassociate from your deeper feelings, and then you translate your behavior into a role that you're playing, and the role that you're playing might have some feelings that are associated with it, sort of like an actor on a stage, feeling the feelings of his character or her character. But at the same time, the feelings are derived from stories and that you tell yourself, and feelings that are they're derived from a self-image, and they're derived from a picture of the self that's not necessarily a complete one. And in broad strokes, with twos, threes, and fours, generally the challenge is to go from playing roles to becoming more real, basically. And that comes out differently with different people, but becoming more real means getting in touch with your deeper feelings rather than the ones that are generated by pictures and images and storylines and roles. So then within four, one thing that I like to do with fours, just in an exploratory way, is to ask them to kind of imagine the person who is suffering and who is in pain. Let's assume they come to me because they are, and begin to witness that part of them rather than to be it. So that you stand back and you witness the part of you that is essentially fourish, and witness the suffering, and then kind of try to sort of work with it and kind of resolve it, at least in a temporary sort of way, so that the person can feel better and continue to function well. And that's the opposite of being totally immersed in the same feeling. And instead of having it out there, you've got it inside, you've inhaled it, you're breathing it, you're living it, it's in your body. And you have body chemistry, for example. If you start to get into a mood and you sort of depress yourself, well, the body chemistry that can go with that might last for a few hours. That's why it's sometimes helpful as a 4 to have little things that you can do to take breaks that are like trance breakers. You know, if you start to sink into a mood, it's time to take a walk, that kind of thing. And people will start to regulate in various ways depending on what they've discovered and what they've learned. But a couple of things that are relevant in terms of envy, you know, envy being summarized in the cliche, the grass is greener on the other side. A lot of times when 4s envy something, an alternative, another person, a superpower version of themselves that they don't feel like they can access. When 4s do this, a lot of times the envied alternative is in color, and their current situation that they want to overcome is in black and white. And you can sort of experiment with that and ask them to, you know, pay attention to the different colors, and the location of the imagery starts to matter as well. Because if there's something that you envy, you have to think about envy as being something that is inherently, by definition, out of reach. Well, how that literally translates into the subjective experience of a 4 is that what they see that they envy is away from them. It's beyond their capacity to quite reach with their arms, and by definition, you know, it's envy, and so it's out of reach. And one of the things that sometimes helps is to have them bring the image closer, have them locate where the image is first, and then have them bring it closer and find out what happens to the image. I had a woman one time who was a 4 who was in love with her doctor, and her doctor was totally unavailable. She was a pretty 2-ish 4 also, and the doctor was young, handsome, I guess, and had small children and a marriage and a busy career. But the client talked about, you know, sort of envying that and kind of wishing that she could, you know, get together with him, and that she you know, had this crush on him. And one of the things I asked her to do was to bring the image of him closer and closer and closer. We did it you know, slowly by degrees. And it started out that he had, you know, kind of like a golden whitish light surrounding his head, and he looked handsome like a movie star, and he was well coiffed, and he was nicely dressed, and, you know, it was great, full of glamour. And then as we brought it closer, the image began to change a little bit, and then it changed a little bit more, and then it changed a little bit more. And what we finally arrived at was a guy with, well, he had kind of bad teeth, and he had a wart that had a little hairs growing out of it and stuff like that. And it was like she was seeing him up close, and he no longer became an envied alternative, as you can imagine. That kind of thing sometimes, though, moving something that the person envies, moving it closer to them, maybe inviting them to inhale it, to bring it in, to let themselves occupy the same space, and find out what strength it brings them. There's an old Paul Simon song called Kodachrome, and the lyrics go, "When I look back on all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can think of at all. And then he says, when I think of all the girls I knew when I was single, if I brought them together for one night, I know they'd never match my sweet imagination, and everything looks worse in black and white." He's talking about envy, and he's talking about submodalities. and I'm pretty sure he's a 4, and that would not be unusual. I don't know. Do we have any 4s in the group? Anyone? Anna, could you volunteer?
Yep. I'm the only 4. That's how we like it.
That's it. Yeah. Well, it's a blessing and a curse. Anything you relate to or can confirm or deny?
Yeah, no, I can confirm. One thing, I knew I was a 4 because of the envy piece. And I know some self-pres 4s say that envy is not a resonant emotion for them. And I've never really understood that I'm a sexual dominant 4.
Yeah, well, a lot of times the self-pres, they're trying to get out of their inner life. Same goes with a 3 wing. You know, there's a tendency to lose yourself in activity or living up to expectations of the world around you, or reacting to the situation around you, and it'd be kind of different. But envy is in there somewhere, even if they're not conscious of it.
Yeah, no, I liked what you said about just zooming in on all the mundane, warts and all details. That rings true for me as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I heard a phrase, it's more vulgar than the way I'm gonna recount it, but it's, for every beautiful woman, there's a man who's tired of sleeping with her. And I think
Wow.
it's helpful for a 4 to remember that, like, we just see the beautiful women everywhere and we think, oh, all these people must have this amazing life. And you have to remember, like, those people too, they have the people who've grown tired of them, who don't want to be around them, who, they have their struggles, because we forget that as 4s.
Well, it's like pretending other people are famous, because when you're famous, you're immune to the laws of karma. That's how it's presented anyway. You live in this glorious elite strata, and mere customers of your movies or your music are on another level.
But that's the weird thing that 4s do, is that we imagine ourselves as protagonists of, like, a movie, and at the same time, the feelings of inadequacy make us think that everybody around us has the idealized life.
Right, which is sort of its own projection in a way. Yeah. Well, have you ever had the experience of envying someone, getting to know them, and finding out they had limitations you wouldn't want?
Oh, all the time. Yeah.
That sometimes is the lesson as well, or sometimes what you get steered towards is recognizing how we're all in the same boat, even though we're occupying different seats in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why that quote is so resonant for me, is that we're prone to idealizing people, and then we have to remember, like, they're all 3-dimensional flawed folks, just as we 4s are.
Yeah. That is a kind of outcome sometimes, if you work with envy, is you start to really realize that, and act on it as well. Okay, well, 3s, and then we're done. One of the things that is common in 3s in their trance is to see other people 2-dimensionally. As it's not like 8 seeing people as cartoons. It's more like seeing people as though they are characters in television advertising, where they represent cultural cliches, maybe cliches of the moment or cliches in general, or where they're representing values of the culture, but they're derivative that way. It's sort of there's something that is on the internet now that I notice a lot, which I think started with James Joyce. And what I'm talking about is a way in which something that is cliched and of a certain, I don't know, background is considered porn. And it's not that it's literal sexual pornography, but it's more like, oh, I went to see this movie and there was all this violence and it was like torture porn. Or somebody else will, describe some other kind of experience in terms of porn. And James Joyce, I don't know if he really started this, but he was onto this back in 1940. And what he said was, he was asked to define tragedy and comedy, and he said that tragedy was a thorough and deep knowledge of the grief of life, and that anything short of that in an artistic representation was porn. So if you see a TV commercial and there's it's the holidays and there's a family waiting at the airport and grandma shows up and the little girl has a sign that says grandma in order to identify her, and your heartstrings are supposed to be tugged, and it's like, oh, kittens, that kind of thing. That's porn, according to Joyce. Anything that doesn't observe the grave and constant in human suffering is porn. And so that is kind of a way sometimes to think about threeness when people are in their trances, as they're seeing other people in this distorted way that is culturally identified and modified. And in doing that, they're dissociated. Threes, sometimes when they're in their trance and they're really going somewhere, or they're really goal oriented, they can see people as objects, and the people are objects that are in the way of the three fulfilling their goals, or they're objects who can be enlisted to help the three fulfill their goals. It's one or the other, but they're still objects. The writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, who I think was a three, wrote a very three-ish book that Americans revere for some reason, called The Great Gatsby. And somebody asked Scott Fitzgerald one time about personality, and he said, personality is defined by a ceaseless expression of gestures. So what he's talking about is the surface. What he's talking about is not the guts, not the inside, but that is the mentality that you can go into within this style when you're in the trance of it. And like I say, people are objects. The world becomes a kind of chessboard, maybe a kind of maze that you're moving through, and you're on your way to a particular goal. It's usually a goal that is, or a path that is defined by the culture around you. If you're a three, you can be more conventionally minded and measure your value as a person by external measuring sticks, like how much money you have, what your status is, things like that. Joseph Campbell said one time, he said, if your path is all laid out for you and the steps are obvious, it's not your path. And I thought that was a good way to put it in relation to threes, because you can be kind of a slave to convention or be so convention minded that you want to excel within known parameters. But at the same time, the challenge really is to become more yourself and to drop into your truer feelings and kind of access a sense of faith. And I don't know, a lot of threes will work towards doing good in the world, improving things around them. They might chase and climb up the ladder of success into thin air for a number of years and then realize that they've actually fulfilled their early goals. And maybe there's a midlife crisis that follows, but a lot of times what the end result is that the person decides to dedicate their skills and their abilities and maybe even enlist their contacts, their friends in some sort of enterprise that makes life better, that is more humanistic, more in relation to matters of the heart than matters of a large bank account or things like that, or a high status. And the threes will start to even kind of have a sense of humor about it, to start to realize that one three said there's me and then there's my image. It's a relationship, and there's a kind of awareness of that. All right, hang on 1 second.
Sure.
1 second. There we go. The camera became unplugged.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a question, Tom, about threes, if you don't mind. Obviously, doing a lot of corporate work, I get a ton of three bosses. And when they work with the Enneagram, they often try to use it to become the perfect boss. And then, they'll decide now they're going to go into authentic leadership. And then even their idea of authenticity is inauthentic. But they bring that tender-heartedness and they really care about people. But it's almost as if there's always some instrumentalism in it. And I'm wondering how you work with that, because it's often quite disorienting for me working with it.
We've had there was a woman who was a three who was a news presenter in the United States years ago, and she seemed to be good at her job, but evidenced no particular self-knowledge. And then she went into therapy and found out a lot about herself and turned around and wrote a book. Now, if a person is a three and they learn a little about themselves and they turn around and write a book, or they turn around and teach a workshop about what they have learned, or they turn around and represent themselves as an expert, a lot of times that's an indicator that nothing's gotten through to them. That is to say, excuse me for a second here. I've still got connection problems. But now they're solved. It's usually an indicator the person is still not quite grasping what the Enneagram anyway has told them. Turning around and representing it in a different way, or there are threes who follow gurus sometimes, and they'll later say, I just tried to be the best exemplar and student of the guru that I could possibly be. Well, that's just more of the same, really. That you're plugging in different content, but it's the same pattern. And the pattern is one of impersonation. within the trance of your style. And there's usually a split between who I aspire to be and who I fear I am. And when threes are in their trance, they're kind of trying to avoid who they fear they are. They might have grown up poor, for example, and then on this other hand, be trying to make as much money as they can to kind of assuage the insecurity that they grew up with. It doesn't work, but it's a good try. And it's a way in which the person is trying to compensate for something. Someone else is, they stutter as a child, and then they take classes as an adult in public speaking. And so they have a really elegant, precise way of public speaking, but the stutterer is still in there somewhere. It doesn't resolve it somehow. It compensates or overcompensates for it. To a degree, it brings a capacity to learn and to, try new things, but also you have to kind of analyze it in relation to a defense. Is it a way in which the person is reacting to something internally that's unconscious that they've always tried to compensate for?
I often find in my coaching relationship with them that I feel like I need to be very delicate with their image more than other types. People speak about different type defense mechanisms, and ultimately they're all equally defensive. But what I notice evoked in me with threes is, be careful.
Well, be careful and don't blow my cover, maybe. Don't take me too deep into this, because I just want a few recommendations or possibilities for doing a better job. Something like that. But that doesn't mean I want to know about what do you call it, self-knowledge, that kind of thing. And there can be a motivation to change that comes out of the external world. Sometimes it'll be a health crisis where the person is charging until they're 50 years old, and then suddenly they have a health collapse or a condition of some sort that develops. Sometimes it can be just kind of recognizing with a shock how much time is passing, maybe getting in touch with your mortality to a greater degree and realizing that you're maybe closer to death than to childhood, and that within that your priorities may have to change or may want to change, or there may be, as threes grow and change, they gravitate, among other things, they gravitate towards the people in their life and the quality of their relationships. And that can become more forefronted. It can become more important to the person.
That story that you told about the child of the weather, why don't you tell them that story? It's such a good story.
Well, there was a man who was a three who was a television reporter in St. Louis in the United States. And he described a turning point for him where he knew he was a workaholic, and he had a couple of young children. And at one point, he was apparently out on television covering a fire and reporting from a fire on TV. And the TV was on at home, in his home, and his wife and one of the daughters was sitting there, and the daughter looked up and saw him and said, "Look, Mama, there's the man who took us to the zoo." Now, this was a wake-up call. This shocked him terribly. And there are other threes who will have similar stories, like, I looked at my son one day and I realized he was an inch taller, that kind of thing, and I hadn't even noticed. That where you start to realize what you're missing, and it starts to have a humanistic or a humanistic cast. You start to become more interested in relationships. There's a connection to 6 that can help a 3 kind of confess what they've been trying to hide, confess their fears or insecurities, that kind of thing. That actually is quite good with some people. It's quite good in coaching to, if they're 3s, to get them to talk about their insecurities. And sometimes they'll have a need to do that. It's almost like going to a priest and confessing, except you don't have the rest of the details that go with being a priest. But saying it out loud, describing how you feel and giving that words and saying it out loud is sometimes really a helpful thing, or they're part of a helpful process with a 3. We don't have any 3s in this group, what's left of it at this point. But in working with them, if a 3 is telling you non-verbally what he's telling you, Ingrid, he's probably saying, well, that's I don't want to go there if I can help it. And I especially don't want to go there because what I'm really interested in is how to do my job better. And I don't see the connection between knowing myself and doing my job better. Something like that. Yeah. I don't know. Does anybody else work with 3s or know any 3s?
What I have found is, it's a bit of a bomb to drop, but telling the 3 that people can see that they're thinking about something else while they're talking to them. And that when they're trying to get buy-in, a metaphor that I find very telling, that people know that they're just trying to get them to agree, and they don't really care, and they're not really listening. And
yes.
For them to realize that people see through it is actually usually quite a catalyst, I find.
Yeah, sounds pretty good. Yeah. Also, pardon me, helping the 3 build a bridge from the external world to their feelings is sometimes a good approach as well, depending on what the person is requesting. But with other clients, not the ones you're talking about, Ingrid, it almost helps to kind of approach emotions from a really basic standpoint. That's sort of like go inside and identify an emotion and give it a name, that kind of thing, where you're really starting with the ABCs. And if a 3 could do amazing things in the world that you can't do, but this is their blind spot in terms of their inner life and their authentic emotions. And helping a 3 go inside is often, it's the direction to go in. It's in contrast sometimes, in my mind, with 4s, where 4s can readily go inside, but they need to sort of have part of them oriented towards the outside world and to be going towards things in reality, rather than just sort of holding back and going into moods and dramas and internal stuff that doesn't really relate to the world around them or the people around them. But with 3s, it's sort of the opposite. Learning how to go inside is quite helpful. I do an exercise that I especially might do with the 3, which is to have them write a letter to their feelings and express everything that they resent about their feelings, and then everything they appreciate about their feelings. And then take a pause, go do something else, go do the dishes or wait another day, and then come back and pretend you are your feelings and write a letter back to the rest of your personality, expressing everything that you resent and everything that you appreciate. And that usually gets a pretty good dialogue going in a way that gets the person mindful of their own, at least several of their levels.
Yeah.
But exercises that support that and support doing support going inside and support. Go ahead.
No support. Carry on.
Just support them going inside themselves and learning about their inner life.
Yeah, I was just going to say about parts working really well, because sometimes the parts they're trying to get rid of that are kind of affecting their performance. Those
Right.
have a lot of interesting things to say.
And that process I was describing before with eights, where you're trying to get two parts of the person that are pretty disparate and discrete, you're trying to get them closer together and then trying to get them to integrate, to meld. And with threes, usually the split is between an image of some kind, a highly successful part of you a way that you want to see yourself, and then it's opposite somehow, an insecure part. So if the person is, you see it with Olympic runners. The person is an accomplished Olympic runner, but they were born with a bad foot. That kind of thing. There'll be that kind of disparity. And whoever the three is trying to convince you or themselves of who they are now, when they're in their trance, the opposite exists somewhere within them. In other words, if I want you to think that I'm accomplished and articulate and smart and excellent in all these different ways, somewhere in me there's a raging insecurity about those very things. And I'm trying to cure the insecurity by identifying with someone I am not, but I'm trying to become that person. And it's great for learning. It's great for learning new skills. Threes can be really good mentorees, and then later subsequently become mentors of others. But trying to learn I guess that's enough. Gee, I think that's everybody, isn't it? No. So let me talk about twos. We'll talk about twos and ones, and then I'll mercifully stop talking. With twos, one of the things that I'm really aware of in working with twos is the way they displace their own feelings, emotions, and needs and send them over to occupy someone that they're focused upon. It's sort of like sending your inner child to live with the neighbors. Sort of like you have a feeling, you have a need, you have something that you want, but your defense and your inhibition is against fulfilling that need directly, because that would be selfish and that would be wrong, and you would not be thinking of others first. And so you displace the need instead, and you relocate it over in somebody else's chest, over in somebody else's psyche. And then you give to yourself through the medium of the other person. You may also be giving to the other person. You might sense that they really need a drink of water, but really what's going on is you're thirsty. And yet you can't just walk over and give yourself water. That would be selfish, and it's something that you're inhibited about, something that you've trained yourself not to be, something that you understood early in life was a bad way to be. And so your water is inside of the other person's water, and you convince them to have a drink of water, and then If they agree, then you have permission to give yourself a drink of water. But meanwhile, you've displaced your whole desire and the self who has them really over in the other person. And then you're giving, they used to call it giving to get, and then some people objected to that. But you are giving to yourself by metaphor, is probably a better way to put it. And in doing that, you are safe. You're safe in the terms of your history back when it was imperative that you put aside your own quote unquote selfish needs and take care of the immature adults in your environment, or manage some sort of conflicted early life, or just play your family role as you're expected to, or play a role as you're expected to as a woman. There's all kinds of conditioning that can go with it, with thinking of others first. And, it sounds good to think of others first, unless it's your neurotic tendency and it takes you further and further away from yourself. That kind of thing. I've known in my career, which is 40 some years, in my work with the Enneagram, I've known twos who they were both intimate subtypes, and they were so fixated and obsessed about someone that they believed in a kind of unconscious way that they were that person. So one woman was fixated on her son, and another woman was fixated on somebody she described as a best friend. But it was in front of a group that knew this woman, the two, and they were all kind of rolling their eyes and shaking their heads because they'd heard this story before that she gave me, which was, I just can't stop thinking about him, or her. I just can't stop, kind of obsessing about what she needs and what would help, and what, how I can be closer to her, that kind of thing. And it was, a weird obsession. But it was also an extreme version of something that twos do anyway, especially when they're in their trance, which is to over-identify with somebody else and to be focused on giving them what they need, which happens coincidentally to be what the two needs. And that kind of feeling occupied by another person, they'll describe it as like, I am that person. I feel them inside me. I'm sitting here, but it's me and that person together somehow. So an over-identification. But in the over-identification, there's also a dissociation from the body. When I work with twos, one of the things I'm trying to do is get them back inside themselves, get them to return to their own emotional location. And from that perspective, like a first person perspective, looking out through their own eyes, feeling through their own feelings, that kind of thing. And that's a difference in location. They return to their true emotional location. Could be, I'll have them, sort of bring themselves back into their body, and then pay attention to where the image wants to live or lives within their subjective awareness. These are all, of course, strange things to say to other human beings, but they generally understand under the circumstances what you're asking for. And in coming into themselves, it's like, well, where does that part of you live? Does it live in your chest? Does it live in your belly? Does it live in your knees and your feet? And the more you sort of question it and put a finer point on it, the more the person kind of connects with themselves in some way. There can be a quality within the trance of the style to say yes to things you want to say no to. And then over the course of that, there's a kind of gradual building tension that sometimes that can then be expressed through anger, where the person kind of erupts because you've gone just one step too far with them. It's what they call a threshold experience. Excuse me. Nines are prone to them also, where you put up with something, you put up with something, you put up with something, and then that's it. You can't stand it anymore, and you're out of there. You're out of the situation, or you're out of the marriage, even if it takes a year or 9 months to actually separate and divorce and distribute assets and things like that. You're out of there the moment that happened emotionally. It's a threshold experience. So twos can have that, and then also one thing that's helpful with them is to assign times to be alone. And what you're assigning is something that they come to anyway. They come to the need. They can lose themselves in a context, in a family, in a job, in a circumstance, and then at a certain point, kind of pull back from it and suddenly realize that they don't recognize themselves in the mirror and that kind of thing. And in doing that, if you assign it and they go off and do it, they often find it very helpful and satisfying. And it's much better than I've had it and I'm going to divorce and I'm going to move to a cabin in the woods and write in my journal all the time. That can be the fantasy, but if you have the person, take a little time for themselves and begin to integrate that into their daily or weekly behavior, that often helps. It often relieves some of the pressure of and helps them return to themselves and restore themselves rather than be endlessly over-identified with somebody else. Anything else? Anybody? All right. So let me talk a little about ones, and then then I will vanish, and y'all can talk about me. When I work with ones, one of the things I want to know is about the role of a critical voice in a problem that they're having. There almost always is one, but not necessarily always, but a lot of the time. The one will have a critical voice, and the critical voice will have a location. This is true of other critical voices in other Enneagram styles. With ones, sometimes the voice will be on their shoulder. If it'll be dissociated, it'll be out there somewhere. If it's not, it'll be inside their head. And sometimes it's helpful to ask them in imagination to take the voice out of their head and to bring it out on their hand and look at it and listen to it, listen to what it's saying from a slight distance. And some of the time I had very good luck. You probably heard this if you've heard any of my recordings or anything. But I've had very good luck with ones moving their critical voice from wherever it's located, on their shoulder, moving it down into their shoe, or moving it out to a distance across a room where they can see it more clearly, or bringing it around and out in front of them, and not only listening to it but also looking at it. What does that look like? And occasionally there'll be a revelation like, well, it looks like my grandfather, but he was an alcoholic. And I don't know why I'm listening to him. He drank himself to death and had 3 bankruptcies, that kind of thing. Or it's it helps to define the voice. Is it your voice? Is it someone else's voice? Is it the voice of God? Is it the voice, a collective voice of all the known forces of rightness? Who's talking and what are they saying? And how do you make it easier to listen to them? Because if you ask ones if they want to get rid of their voice, their critical voice, like you as a coach or you as a therapist have the ability to amputate such a thing. They'll always say no. They'll say, no, the voice, it keeps me honest. It keeps me trying. It keeps me motivated. I just wish it would shut up sometimes. It talks too much, or it talks too loud, or it's kind of mean. I wish it was nicer, that kind of thing. And that's what you wind up working with. If you're trying to amputate the voice, it won't work. And the voice will have an opinion about your efforts. One of the other things that I've seen with ones is a tendency to think like an idealist and to think in frozen pictures. Pictures like a photograph, like a painting, but something representational, but still it's frozen. It's not a movie. And if you think about it, it kind of makes a certain amount of sense. I have high ideals. I'm kind of a perfectionist. I talk to myself about my efforts and my perfectionism, but I want to live up to those ideals. I want to not only get away from the pain of chaos and disorder, but I want to go towards a sense of myself and a sense of living in a world where things are done right. And in things being done right, I have a picture of that. And the picture is usually frozen. And usually a frozen picture will not admit process, like I was saying before. And so you have a frozen picture, you have an ideal, and then it's like you have a mountain in front of you and no obvious way to climb it. And that's different from breaking up the frozen picture and turning it into a movie, having the person turn it into a movie. Because movies admit process. There is a way in which there is one step follows another, follows another. And in that process, you might see how to do something that was otherwise puzzling or baffling or intimidating and difficult. So turning frozen pictures into movies, every once in a while it's the other way around. And I've had some clients who were ones, a few, who they saw movies in their mind's eye when they were tormenting themselves about becoming better. And somehow turning those movies into frozen pictures was a good move. It relieves some tension and relieves some expectation within the person. I don't remember the exact details, but it's just saying it can work both ways. And body tension is something to pay attention to with this style. Ones will sometimes with a 2-wing, they'll be pretty emotional and they'll talk in emotional terms. Sometimes with a 9-wing, they'll be less emotional and more, when they talk about their feelings, they're talking about their body feelings. They're talking about a tension here, or the temperature in the room, or whether the chair is comfortable or not. And those body feelings, a lot of times if a 1 is in their trance, they'll rigidify. They'll hold themselves a certain way. They might lean forward a certain way. They might rise their shoulders up around their ears, and they'll say things like, well, being this hard on myself is really tiring, as in physical exhaustion. Yeah. So the other thing is working with the tone of voice and the way in which the 1 talks to themselves. And can you modify that in some way? Can you help them modify that? In other words, if they talk to themselves in a harsh, critical way, what would it be like if they sang it instead? What would it be like if they talked to themselves in a harsh, critical way, but played circus music behind it? Or what would it be like if they talked to themselves in a harsh, critical way, but they slowed down what they said to about 15%, so that when I'm talking to myself about what a terrible person I am, it becomes harder and harder to keep a straight face. It changes the emotion, it changes the feeling reaction in the person, and is sometimes helpful, sometimes gets them in touch with agency in the way we've been talking about. If a voice is loud, what happens if you make it soft? If a voice is close, what happens if you move it far away? And so on. Working with the various qualities of it, and then even sometimes working with the content of it. If a person says, I should always take care of my family, they have a list of rules for living, and one of them is, I should always take care of my family. But it's almost like you signed a contract but didn't read the fine print, because maybe your brother's son is a drug dealer, and he's just gotten busted and he's in jail, and he wants you to bail him out. Should you really help him in that circumstance? Does the rule, I should always help my family, apply to a circumstance like that? And the person might start to question, come up with counterexamples. And also teaching ones to listen to themselves, talk about what's wrong or missing or out of place or not adequate, and asking them to summarize some of those phrases. I've done this with a number of ones where I'll ask them to listen to themselves for a week and to write down anything they think might be what they call in hypnosis a negative command. A negative command is, don't think of white monkeys. That's a negative command. And what you wind up doing is thinking of white monkeys and then, trying to wipe out the image or put a red X through it or something like that. It's a paradox. And when ones are in their trance, they can be really focused on the white monkeys and not really on the goal or the purpose or the function. You're sort of looking for what's wrong, missing, and out of place, and that somebody is to be blamed for. Maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody else, but at the same time, it's not propelling you towards a positive solution or any kind of just a goal that takes you out of yourself and takes you beyond the behavior. So sometimes ones can be helped by listening to the negative commands that they typically give, and then learning to rephrase them in positive terms. In other words, if a man says to his son, I don't want you to screw up the yard work this week. I don't want you to, do that thing you did that last time where the yard work was really substandard. And that would be the opposite of saying to the son, I really am kind of very happy when you do a really good job. And I'm kind of looking forward to this one and hoping that, there's various problems out in the yard that only you can solve. You're talking in a much different way. You're talking in terms of possibility. You're talking in terms of outcome rather than in terms of what you don't want to have happen. And that really matters with ones, both in terms of how you as a coach might talk to them, but how they also talk to themselves. The other thing about being self-critical that I've probably already, I don't know, some of you may have heard it already, but I'll often have ones do something where they're being simultaneously self-critical and doing something else that actually cuts against it. So one woman that I had who was a one, she had enjoyed when she was a kid, she learned to be a tap dancer. Now she was in her 40s and she hadn't tap danced for a long time. But what we arranged was an exercise for her to sing her self-criticism while she tap danced. Now, that's a really different physiology than the physiology a one might have when they're, say, sitting still in a room, their shoulders are up around their ears, and they're talking to themselves in an intense way about what's missing, wrong, or out of place, or some mistake that they made. That's a different physiology than tap dancing. And merging those two things together sometimes has been helpful because it turns it into something kind of fun. And the person realizes more and more that they have the responsibility for creating this stuff in themselves, but they also have agency for doing something with it. There's a lot of other things to say, but I've been talking quite a while. You've been listening for quite a while. Congratulations. Thank you. It's not easy to listen past 20 minutes, they say. So apparently listening is a superpower.
Oh, thank you so much. So brilliant.
Are there any other questions or comments or feedback or accusations before I go?
I think I personally feel like I'm downloaded half the Akashic records and have a lot to think about. I don't know about anyone else. Alison's doing the party emoji.
It's been brilliant. Good. Really good. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us. Well, good. And with me. Thank you.
Really.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom.
So take care.
Stay
it's lunchtime here in Central Oregon, and hope you all got something you can use and take it forward in time. And if it comes back to you when you're working with clients, that'd be all the better. And maybe see you again sometime.
Thank you. Thanks.
So, thanks a lot.
Practical.
Ciao.
Ciao, Tom. Stay well. Ciao.